Good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. We'll just give it a few moments for all of our guests to arrive and then we'll kick things off. So good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. Come in, please say hello, introduce yourself in the chat and feel free to tell us where you're joining us from. Don't be shy. Thank you for joining us again. And my name is Emily. And on behalf of Teachers College Press, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us for the presentation on Literacy Classrooms That S.O.A.R, Strategic Observation and Reflection in the Elementary Grades. This book is co-authored by Susan O'Hara, Robert Pritchard, and Debbie Pitta, who are all here this afternoon with us. Let me, if I may, give you a brief roadmap for our time this afternoon. I'm going to give some very brief introductions to the book and the authors, quickly go over some housekeeping matters, and then turn it over to the authors for the main presentation. We're scheduled for an hour more or less this afternoon, but anyone who is unable to stay the whole time or has to step away, rest assured we are recording this conversation and the recording will be made available to all registrants in a few days' time. It'll be sent out via email. So please look out for that and feel free to share it with any colleagues who are unable to join us this afternoon. Also to that end, please do ask questions. If at any point during the presentation you have a question or a comment, please chime in and put that in the Zoom chat panel or the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to get to those towards the end of our time together. Let me speak now just a little bit about the book itself. This book, which has a foreword by Douglas Fisher, was published by Teachers College Press in late 2020. So it's been out for just a few months now, and we're so excited to be bringing it to you this afternoon. Literacy Classrooms That S.O.A.R is a resource to support professional learning and growth across schools and districts by means of the SOAR Teaching Frames for Literacy, which focus on high-impact research-based practices. But you don't have to take my word for it. We're very pleased to report that the book just received a scholarly review in Teachers College Record. And by way of introduction, I'm just going to quote from that very briefly. Quote, recently, there has been more of a consensus between researchers and policymakers about the importance of using content-rich curriculum in elementary grades to help develop language comprehension, background knowledge, and academic vocabulary. However, teachers may not have the instructional tools to implement high-quality curriculum that develops academic language. The book, Literacy Classrooms That S.O.A.R, provides a clear, actionable, and practical guide for teachers to increase their instruction of academic language and develop deeper and more robust literacy instruction for their students. So to present the SOAR teaching frames this afternoon, we are very fortunate to have with us here the authors of the book. Susan O'Hara is a former director of the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching at Stanford University. Robert Pritchard is a professor emeritus of education at Sacramento State University. And Debbie Pitta is a vice president of professional learning at EPF for Teaching. All three are former K-12 teachers with more than 40 years of classroom experience and extensive experience supporting districts to build institutional capacity. Last but certainly not least, we are offering a discount on the book at Teachers College Press, so please consider buying the book, and please look for the information about how to access that discount in the chat panel. Teachers College Press publishes all kinds of books for teachers and teacher educators, and we are very pleased to be able to present webinars like this one today free of cost. So if you like what you see this afternoon, please visit our website, sign up for our e-newsletter, and follow us on social media to keep up with all the goings on of the press and our authors in the field of education. So with that, thank you again for being here, and I'll hand it over to the authors.
Good afternoon. This is Susan O'Hara. We're delighted to welcome you to our talk. And this afternoon, what we want to do is spend a little bit of time giving you a context for how the SOAR teaching frames came to be, and then spend some time giving you some insight into the tools and materials that go along with the SOAR teaching frames that are in our book. So our work with schools and districts has shown us that instruction and student learning improve when an entire school is focused on a common set of high impact instructional practices. So this is the driving premise behind our work. And this approach we've seen creates a common vision in a language that promotes collaboration and engages teachers, instructional coaches, and principals in a focused dialogue on achieving their instructional goals. As one of the superintendents we work with commented, not only do the frames provide us with common language and specific definitions of effective teaching practice, but they also served as a detailed model for teachers, principals, and coaches. So we designed the tools, the SOAR teaching frames and all the tools that go with them, as tools that districts could use to engage in cycles of strategic observation and reflection to elevate instruction. And so the name SOAR is an acronym. It comes from strategic observation and reflection. And we know from our research and a lot of other research in the field that it's essential for teachers to have access to a set of tools for planning, reflecting, and elevating their instruction. And this is very powerful when they do it collaboratively. In addition, teachers need specific examples of what it looks like to structure and differentiate opportunities for students to engage with complex informational text, use evidence in research and writing, discuss sophisticated disciplinary content, and work collaboratively to present ideas and communicate multiple perspectives. So these are all key aspects of the Common Core state standards, next generation science standards, and most state curriculum frameworks. So the SOAR teaching frames were designed to support instruction that's rooted in these standards, but is also rooted in providing equitable and rigorous instruction for each and every student. As such, SOAR draws on research on best practice, as well as the research on educational equity. So when the SOAR teaching frames are adopted, as we have seen, as a framework by schools and districts, with all teachers using them and sharing instructional ideas, they become a really powerful tool for elevating instruction that's differentiated to meet the needs of every student. And so as such, SOAR was developed not as an add-on for teachers and coaches, but as a set of tools designed to strengthen the implementation of curriculum frameworks in a variety of instructional settings and to drive improvements in teaching and learning across schools and districts. So as such, SOAR is not a curriculum, nor is it a set of strategies. SOAR is a lens you look through as you plan, teach, reflect on, and elevate your teaching practice. We created the SOAR teaching frames for literacy to help teachers meet the disciplinary content and language needs of all of their students. And the SOAR teaching frames support teachers in elevating literacy instruction across content areas by teaching students how to have discussions, engage with complex text, identify and use evidence to support claims, and effectively communicate orally and in writing. And from more than a decade of our research, 4 instructional practices emerged that have demonstrated significant impact on student learning in Common Core classrooms. And we refer to these as the SOAR high impact practices. And the first of these is disciplinary discussions. And at this point, I should add that in this context, disciplinary refers to across the curriculum in all content areas. So the practice disciplinary discussions focuses on fostering students' ability to engage in student-to-student disciplinary discussions, where they build on their ideas, where they express their own ideas clearly, and where they work with peers to co-construct meaning. Disciplinary interactions with complex text focuses on developing students' ability to understand the academic language and structure of complex texts, which facilitates comprehension and content knowledge. Disciplinary uses of evidence focuses on supporting students' use of multiple pieces of evidence in disciplinary writing and speaking. And disciplinary communication focuses on strengthening the quantity and quality of students' oral and written communication. So these are the 4 high impact practices that form the center of the SOAR work. And for this webinar today, we are going to go in depth with disciplinary discussions. So the SOAR work has been conducted with teachers at various stages in their careers, from beginning teachers to veteran teachers. And we've worked with large, mid-sized, and small districts in urban, rural, and suburban settings. So for example, we've worked with the Los Angeles Unified School District, and we've worked with Boston Public Schools. And we've also worked with teacher preparation and teacher induction programs. And in each context, the work we've facilitated has aimed to build capacity for improved disciplinary language and literacy development of all groups of students. And we've designed a series of studies that we conducted to investigate the impact of the use of the SOAR teaching frames on teachers' ability to plan, implement, reflect on, and ultimately elevate their instruction. Because our work aims to narrow the achievement gap, the context for the studies varied with respect to student and teacher diversity. And across all studies, analysis of growth on key instructional practices indicated that there was significant positive differences between the teachers using SOAR and comparison teachers. And the impact of these instructional changes was also evident in student outcomes. So results across all our studies show that students significantly improved their disciplinary discussion and communication skills as a result of the intervention. And so here are just a few of the citations if you're interested in the research that goes behind the teaching frames in the book. And you can also check out some of our additional publications at soarpractices.org. So now I'm going to hand over to Bob to talk about the disciplinary discussions teaching frame.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are now going to look at what we call a teaching frame, which is comprised of practices that work together to support student learning. The first component of a teaching frame is a high impact practice, which could be any of the 4 our research has identified. Since this webinar focuses on disciplinary discussions, we will be using that as the high impact practice in this example. Below the high impact practice is a set of cross-cutting practices, which our research has shown are necessary to support the high impact practice. These cross-cutting practices are facilitating acquisition of academic language, fostering metacognition for disciplinary learning, and monitoring and guiding disciplinary learning. Whether teachers are focusing on disciplinary discussions or any of the other high impact practices, they should always be implementing these cross-cutting practices because they represent good pedagogy that cuts across all subject areas and grade levels. For instance, academic language is as much a concern in language arts as it is in social studies. And whether you are teaching primary grades or middle school, you need to help students become strategic learners by fostering their metacognition, while helping yourself monitor and guide their learning as effectively as possible. Finally, each high impact and cross-cutting practice is supported by the foundational practice, designing instruction for disciplinary thinking and understanding. So, a single high impact practice, together with a cross-cutting and foundational practice, comprise what we call a teaching frame. Unlike many teaching checklists that contain discrete practices that do not relate to one another in significant ways, our frames show the interconnectedness and interdependence of our practices and help teachers see how these essential practices support one another. This slide is a more detailed version of the disciplinary discussions teaching frame. This version contains what we call elements, which help define each practice. Notice that the high impact and cross-cutting practices each have 2 elements, while the foundational practice has 3. In just a few moments, we are going to explore in more depth the elements of disciplinary discussions to help you understand how teachers use them to guide instruction. For now, there are 3 points that I'd like to emphasize. First, each practice has elements. Second, the structure of all teaching frames is the same, with the exception of the high impact practice at the top. Third, the teaching frame as a whole forms the lens teachers use to plan, teach, reflect on, and elevate their instruction. This quotation captures what happens when students engage in meaningful conversations and why it's so critical to foster students' ability to do this well. Conversation is a meeting of minds with different memories and habits. When minds meet, they don't just exchange facts, they transform them, reshape them, draw different implications from them, engage in new trains of thought. Conversation doesn't just reshuffle the cards, it creates new cards. Fostering environments for disciplinary discussions requires first an intentional focus on the structures that promote talk. For instance, conversation skills, prompt and response starters, appropriate syntax. And second, the same purposeful planning that teachers bring to the teaching of grade level content. For instance, an interesting topic, challenging prompts, a process for monitoring and guiding students while they are engaged in conversation. Element one of disciplinary discussions is build conversation skills. We have identified these skills as create, clarify, fortify, and negotiate. As students develop these skills, they build and elaborate on each other's ideas, express their own ideas clearly, and negotiate meaning. Teachers provide support for students to use these skills with a variety of partners and prompt for their use during instructional activities. Of course, helping students develop the 4 conversation skills isn't enough. Teachers must provide opportunities for students to engage in discussions, and those opportunities must be both extended and supported. In just a moment, Debbie will guide you through an example of what we mean by an extended and supported opportunity. To enable teachers to develop a deeper understanding of what we mean by using SOAR as a lens, we engage them in an analysis activity for each teaching frame. First, teachers examine a non-model of a lesson created by a teacher who was unfamiliar with SOAR. Here's an example. It shows the standards that will be addressed and the basic tasks students will be asked to do. Then we ask them to consider how this lesson could be strengthened by incorporating into the plan all of the practices in the SOAR teaching frame. This helps them see the teaching frames as a lens they can use to elevate instruction and ultimately affect student learning. After the non-model, we guide them through the process of examining a lesson created by a teacher who is familiar with SOAR and who has used SOAR as a lens in her planning. The annotated lesson shows the alignment with the 5 practices of the teaching frame, so participants can see how this teacher included each of the practices of the frame in her planning. For instance, in the 4th row of the model, you see DD2, which stands for element 2 of disciplinary discussions, the high impact practice. In that cell is a short statement of how the teacher will be addressing that practice. Teacher provides extended opportunities by having students use the conversation skills. To the right, you see a description of what the students will do. Working with their Rhino partner, have students review the graphic organizer they created after reading several texts about zoos. Then discuss the author's points of view, as well as the evidence or reasoning the authors used to support their viewpoints. Let's look at another example in the last row of this model. You see FAAL2, or Facilitating Acquisition of Academic Language, element 2. Teacher provides opportunities to acquire and use academic language of agreeing and disagreeing. How exactly is the student going to do that? Well, look to the right, label 4 corners of the room. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Have students go to corners and match up with students with different opinions and discuss. Explain this discussion is a bit different since they are discussing points of view. Provide sentence frames. Okay. Finally, we have teachers step inside a classroom by reading a vignette that illustrates how the teacher uses the SOAR lens to implement the lesson. You see an example of this in the highlighted portion of the last paragraph. She then has students go to one of the four corners of the room labeled strongly agree, etc. She has students meet up with students from opposite corners to discuss their position. Using their conversation prompts and graphic organizers, students discuss their points of view and the reasoning that supports them. After a few minutes, she has students move to a new partner and discuss again. You see the thought bubble to the right. It prompts out exactly what the activity accomplishes. The four corners activity provides an opportunity for students to use academic language, talk with other students, and crystallize their own thinking. This three-step analysis activity using the non-model, model, and vignette helps teachers understand the practices and how to apply the frame. We include this activity with examples of model lessons and illustrative vignettes in each chapter of the book that addresses a specific teaching frame.
Good afternoon. In each book, what Bob just walked us through is exactly how each chapter starts. After that, we then move into the instructional strategies. So I'm now going to give you a few brief examples of the types of instructional strategies that are in the book to help teachers strengthen and support student-to-student disciplinary discussions. There are instructional strategies for each of the cross-cutting and foundational practices also. Element 1 of disciplinary discussions is build conversation skills, which means teaching each skill to your students. This is an area that we have found that teachers have not done very well. So we really concentrate on this piece. We have created posters to support teachers in teaching the SOAR conversation skills. The first one shows all four conversation skills. We created it like a Tetris to show how the conversation skills interconnect with one another. We have identified different sub-skills that exemplify each skill. The next poster is an example of the conversation skill clarify. You see two heads, students talking to each other using sample sentence stems. We have similar posters for the other three skills. We have also created these skills in a Spanish version. Students need to be taught each conversation skill. This chart describes what each skill requires and the prompt responses and starters that would be used for each one. This chart can be used to create an anchor chart with your students or duplicated for students to keep in their folders. Let's look at each conversation skill. The first skill is create. And as you see, the skill requires staying on topic, building on others' ideas, making claims, and considering multiple points of views. And on the next column, you see the prompt starters and responses. Then we have clarify, again, elaborating ideas, paraphrasing, etc. And then on the right, those prompt responses and starters. The next skill is fortify, and that's supporting ideas with evidence, identifying multiple examples of evidence, and explaining how evidence supports an idea. And again, you see the prompts and response starters. And the last one is negotiate. This is agreeing and disagreeing. This one is the one that students have the most difficult doing because they think it's not polite to disagree with someone. So this is a skill that we really have to talk about, that it's not about the person, it's about the ideas that we're trying to co-construct and get deeper in our understanding of the content. And you see that we have those prompt starters and responses. All right, in the book, there's also a lesson plan ideas that really bring that home, what I just talked about. What we have here is a teacher that we're going to watch this video. It's only 4 minutes. And it's a 5th grade teacher in a district that we have worked with. And they have adopted SOAR as the lens that they use to plan, teach, reflect on, and elevate their teaching. As you watch this video, keep in mind element 1, because that's what we're using this for, is for you to see element 1 and how she builds and refers to the conversation skills.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to see you this morning. So, of course, we're doing disciplinary discussions that we've been practicing this year. We've been practicing several of the skills. The first one was create. What was our first skill we practiced?
Create.
And then we worked on clarify. What did we work on next?
Clarify.
And we've also been working on fortify. What have we been working on?
Fortify.
But today we're going to be focusing on clarify. And we know that clarify has 3 sub-skills. How many sub-skills?
3 subs.
Nice, excellent. And so we've reviewed those. But before we get started, I want to ask you a question. And I want you to practice taking a little
Think time.
Why are we doing this anyway? What's the point of doing disciplinary discussion? You don't have to raise your hand yet because we're taking our think time. What is the big picture? Let's repeat the question together. Everybody say, what is the big picture?
What is the big picture?
Why are we doing this anyway?
Why are we doing this anyway?
All right, so let's take a little think time. When you know your answer, you give me a thumbs up. And it's okay if you don't know the answer, you can just take a guess. So why are we doing this? Something that you think. So you're going to turn to your partners. Go ahead and turn to your partners. And share, why do you think we are doing this?
Why do you think we are doing this?
We're going to practice our norms of discussion. What are we going to practice?
Our norms of discussion.
Excellent. We're basically going to review them. And you guys have been doing this all year, so you know these really well. And we've got a chart right here in case you need to remember and remind yourself. So let's read this title together. Ready, read. Conversation norms. The first one is use your think time. You guys are really good about that. Number 2, use the language of the skill. And we have those all here, so we're going to review that in a minute. Number 3 is use a conversation voice. Obviously level 1 or 2, so your partner can hear you, but across the room they can't. You guys are great at that. Number 4, listen respectfully and attentively, which would mean if you're listening to your partner respectfully, you're looking them in the eye, not like looking away or trying to talk to a different partner across the room, right? You guys are great at that. Number 5, ready, read. Take turns and build on each other's ideas. And again, you guys are really good about that. So now we're going to try to remind ourselves about these 3 sub-skills that go with clarify. What is our first sub-skill, everybody?
Paraphrase.
And we did a little bit of TPR, which was like the hand movements. Take some think time. Why do we do hand movements? Why do we do TPR and try to do hand movements? Everybody?
Metacognition.
What does that mean, though? What is metacognition? Giovanni?
Thinking about your thinking.
Nice, excellent. And that's something we've practiced a lot this year. We want to practice thinking about our thinking, and we even came up with a hand movement for metacognition, which is based in Harry Potter, right? When he wants to sneak off into the library or do something in the middle of the night, he puts on his cloak of invisibility, right? And then when he's done, he unveils, right? And we talked about unveiling our thinking, right? We're taking off that cloak of invisibility so you can see what we're thinking. And that's why we do the hand movements, because it helps us remember things and learn better. All right, so let's see if we can remember our hand movement for paraphrase that Mr. Byram taught us. All right, take a little think time. Try to remember our hand movement, because this was a while back since we've done this. All right, do you guys remember it? It goes with listen and repeat. Let's practice it together. Listen and repeat. And that's what paraphrase means, right? You're listening to your partner and you're repeating it. And then we said we have some sentence starters. Do you have to use these sentence starters? No. If you feel really comfortable, you can make up your own. But if you want to practice these, that's great.
All right, so we saw this teacher reviewing 3 of the skills with her students and explaining that they are going to work on clarifying. She reviews the conversation norms with her students and the TPR for paraphrasing. She points to sentence starters that are posted on the wall. The next step in the lesson, she addresses element 2, extending and supported opportunities for students to engage in discussions. She does that by having the students have a discussion around a prompt. So this is all she's doing at this point, is reminding the students about these skills so that it's prepping them for when they had that discussion. Now we're going to look at some instructional strategies that we use to illustrate element 2, supported and extended opportunities for students to have a discussion. This strategy is called layering text. Let's look at what it says. A text set is a collection of resources from different genre, media, and levels of reading difficulty that are designed to support the learning of readers with a range of experiences, interests, and abilities. Let's look at a sample. Here's an example of the text set we put together. This is the collection of photos, a short article, and a song. The selection of text and the order you present them to your students is very important. For this text set, we begin with the photographs as the entry point for all students. Next, we have the graphic organizer that students will fill out for this activity. As they work through each text with their partner or group, you see a column for each text, and at the top of each column, there are discussion prompts that support the students' use of the conversation skills. Those sentence stems help students, and that's the support that we're talking about when we talk about element 2. Of course, we take away those as kids become more proficient and don't need those. Under the prompts are spaces for students to write their responses. And at the bottom of each column is a prompt to get students to summarize their thinking. The next slide is the visual text photos that we wanted to show you up close. This is to easily engage students in their thinking. The basic prompt is, what do you notice? We want students to brainstorm everything that they notice in these photos and then conclude, what do they think? Then they move to a text. The second piece of text is an article. We ask students to read the article and again, work in their groups to discuss what they learned. After writing down all of the things they learned, they then respond to the prompt at the bottom, our thinking has changed, taking into account how this adds to or changes their ideas that they came up with from those photos. The third piece of text is the song Buffalo Soldiers by Bob Marley. And of course, if we played it right now, you guys would be singing it for the rest of the day. So again, students use the graphic organizer as support to talk about what they learned from the song and how it adds to their overall thinking. There's a lot of details and facts in Bob Marley's songs that creates an extensive conversation that students and then as a whole class can have. They then discuss and write what they can conclude about all 3 texts. This means they need to use the skill of negotiate to synthesize all of the information in those 3 texts. Layering text offers students multiple entry points into the text, which enables all students to become engaged in the content and participate more fully in the discussion. As you can see, layering text provides students with extended and supported opportunities to discuss the content. These disciplinary discussions are possible for all grade levels, and primary grade students have been just as successful as our upper grade teachers or students. When teaching younger students to have a discussion, you have to begin by focusing on really creating an idea, having students look at each other, stay on topic, and ask questions about their partner's idea. Here's a text set that we created for primary students. We have a poem, an informational text, and a video, which is a song. The teacher takes on the task of filling out the classroom graphic organizer after students have had their discussion about each text and share out the facts they learned about amphibians. Let's take a minute to watch the video Amphibians. I want you to notice that even though this is a catchy song that you will be singing in your head all day long, there are a lot of facts embedded in the video.
Toad, frog, pollywog. Toad, frog, pollywog. Toad, frog, pollywog. Salamanders and water dogs. Amphibians. They like to swim in the water. They also walk on land. They like to be wet, not dry, and they really like to eat worms, bugs, and flies. Toad, frog, pollywog. Toad, frog, pollywog. Ribbit, ribbit.
So here we have, just to recap, the layering text is really about the content, but getting to the content through the students' discussion. So to conclude this section, there's a chapter in our book for each of the 4 teaching frames, which highlight instructional strategies, tools, and lessons for implementing the high impact practice, each of the 3 cross-cutting practices, as well as the foundational practice. These are meant to help the teacher understand the practices better and see how the cross-cutting practices and the foundational practice support the high impact practice. Now, Susan will share how SOAR, when used by a school or district, can have a powerful impact on professional learning and student learning as they use it as a lens to plan, teach, reflect on, and elevate their teaching.
So now that you've had an opportunity to explore some pieces of the disciplinary discussion frame, one of the 4 frames, we want to talk about how the frames have been used to foster teacher growth from beginning teachers to more experienced teachers. And the SOAR frames help teachers teach with metacognition. So the SOAR lens helps teachers think about how the 5 practices of a teaching frame are integrated and interconnected during instruction to drive student learning. By keeping the SOAR teaching frame at the forefront of their planning and teaching, the lessons will more effectively reach all students and address their needs. So it's critical for teachers to understand how each practice works in conjunction with the others in the frame and how to address each of them in their lesson design. So we came up with what we call the metacognitive continuum, and this describes the stages that teachers go through as they're using the SOAR frames. And this is from the research and partnership work we've done across many schools and districts. So the first stage is a teacher who has no familiarity with SOAR and therefore is unable to use it as a lens to plan, teach, and reflect. The second stage depicts a teacher who's been introduced to SOAR but is still learning how to use a teaching frame and the instructional practices that support learners who are engaged in disciplinary discussions. And so teachers at this stage of the continuum, they tend to equate SOAR with the use of certain instructional strategies. So like layering text, they tend to think of implementation of a strategy like layering text rather than a specific high impact disciplinary discussions, for example, practice, cross-cutting, or foundational practice. Teachers at the third stage we've seen on the continuum have developed a deeper understanding of SOAR, and they now have the ability to use the frame, to use the high impact practice or a cross-cutting practice or a foundational practice as a lens to plan, teach, and reflect. But because their focus is at the practice level, the impact of the planning reflection process is still limited. So finally, teachers at the last stage have developed a deep understanding of how all the practices of a SOAR teaching frame work together and how the frame can be used as a lens to plan, monitor, evaluate, and adjust their instructional goals and teaching strategies in accordance with their students' needs and the context in which they teach. And so using SOAR in this way to teach at this last level is really teaching with metacognition, and it has the greatest impact on the academic development of students, as we've seen from the research that we've conducted. As we've worked with lots of districts, we tend to work with districts with teams of coaches, teachers, and instructional leaders, principals. Based on our understanding of the metacognitive continuum, we know that engaging teams and engaging teachers in multiple cycles of planning, teaching, and reflecting with a focus, common language, and constructive feedback from others is what leads to elevated instruction. So our SOAR work is generally with teams going through these strategic observation and instruction cycles. And that's why the book, we say the subtitle of the book is Strategic Observation and Reflection in the Elementary Classroom. The SOAR inquiry cycle is a way to support teachers as they go through the process of planning, teaching, observing, reflecting, and elevating instruction. At the planning stage, we can help the teachers by using guiding questions to co-plan with them and using the language of the frame to co-plan with them. Then as the teacher is teaching and implementing the practices in the frame to address their student needs, peers or a coach can observe, or better still, video teacher instruction, and then use the SOAR rubrics, which I'll show you in a minute, as well as the SOAR frame to identify areas or instructional moves where the teacher has strength, as well as those where the teacher can improve or elevate. And a great way for groups and teams to reflect is to take the SOAR teaching frame and look at the video together, and then reflect using this common language that's embedded in the frame. And then in the last step, where the teacher's deciding, what do I need to do differently? How can I incorporate some of the cross-cutting practices to support the high impact practice? The coach or a peer group can use the SOAR guiding questions and some actionable feedback from the SOAR rubrics to help plan the next step. So in this way, we're bringing the SOAR frames and tools as a lens into every step of the cycle. So it comes in as you plan, as you teach, as you reflect, and as you apply, and then ultimately elevate instruction. So we've developed what I was talking about here, the SOAR guiding questions. We developed guiding questions for each practice to help teachers think about using the frame and what questions they should pose to make sure that they're incorporating all the practices in a frame into their lessons. And what you will notice here is that we start with the foundational practice when teachers are planning, and then we have questions related to the high impact practice and then the cross-cutting practices. And the brackets here show you that there are questions that are aligned with what Bob discussed with you, the elements of the practice. So there are questions, for example, under the high impact practice disciplinary discussions that relate to build conversation skills. How will you introduce or refer to disciplinary conversation skills? What supports will you provide to enable students to use these skills? So as you go through these questions, you can see that they are all aligned with the frame. We found that teachers use these guiding questions in their planning and reflecting, as well as when they watch their partner teach a lesson. So they can use it for observing others and giving actionable feedback. And they're very helpful for instructional coaches. And we've also had them used by principals and instructional leaders when they're observing teachers and giving feedback. Each teaching frame has a corresponding set of implementation rubrics. And you can see here in this rubric that we have two elements, E1 and E2, and these are the rubrics just for the high impact practice, disciplinary discussion. Element 1 is build conversation skills, as you remember, and element 2 is provide extended and supported opportunities for students to engage in discussion. And what you can see as we go through, we'll just take the first row, how the language progresses from no implementation to full implementation. So for building conversation skills, no implementation, the teacher does not introduce or refer to disciplinary conversation skills. At the next level, the teacher's introducing or referring to these skills, but not providing supports for students to use them during tasks and activities. At the next step up, the teacher is introducing and referring to them, and she's providing support, but to enable most students to use them. And then at full implementation, the teacher introduces and or refers to the skills. She provides support to enable all students to use them and with diverse partners. So you can see how the language of the rubric builds so that teachers can see the instructional moves that they need to make to move from one level of a practice to the next. And we have rubrics for all of the practices in each of the frame, and these rubrics can be found also in our book. We also have student rubrics. So we look at assessing student learning in terms of the kinds of things that we want students to do for the frames. So for disciplinary discussions, we have what you call the formative assessment of student talk. And this is a tool that teachers can use to monitor disciplinary discussions, analyze student participation, and provide constructive feedback. This tool contains 3 dimensions, and each of these are scored on a 4-point rubric. So you see 2 of the points here, but the rubrics are a 4-point rubric. The first dimension is building up an idea, and this focuses on the clarity of the discussion, the extent to which it addresses the prompt or task, and whether or not it leads to co-construction of new ideas. The second dimension is using academic language, which focuses on which academic language features are used in discussion and whether or not the discourse feature is used appropriately to convey ideas. And the third dimension, which is applying metacognitive strategies, focuses on whether or not students are monitoring their own discussions and, when needed, applying strategies appropriately and independently to keep the discussion on topic and moving forward. So in our work, teachers use FAST to monitor discussions in one of 2 ways. They can use it during a lesson in which students are engaged in discussion and they're listening to 1 or 2 student pairs for evidence of 1 or more of the dimensions in the rubrics. They also can use it to analyze a written transcript or a videotape of student discussions after a lesson and provide students with targeted feedback to help strengthen their next discussion. So these allowed in these cycles of inquiry, the practice rubrics allow teams to gather evidence of teaching, and some of these rubrics, like the formative assessment student talk, allow them to gather evidence of student learning. And then when they look and discuss and have dialogue around the teaching in their reflections, they can use student evidence and teacher evidence. So using the frames and corresponding tools as an approach to teacher development leads to teachers who are better equipped to meet the literacy needs of all their students. And in the book, what you'll find is the set of tools, the frames, the rubrics, the guiding questions, instructional strategies, and lessons that go along with each of the 4 teaching frames. And these, we have found in our work, have had, as we said at the beginning, significant impact on teaching and learning. So we're going to end there and take questions. You can check out our work at soarpractices.org. You can see that we have publications. There are some summer professional learning experiences with SOAR coming up that are free because we are being sponsored by the California Collaborative for Excellence in Education. Also, definitely, as Emily said at the beginning, there's a discount on the book with the promo code that she sent in the chat. So check out our resources for sure. And now we'll just, if you have any questions for us, just share them in the chat and we'll try to answer any of the questions that you have. So one question that has come up is, from the studies you've conducted, what would you say has been one of the main impacts of the SOAR framework on teachers? And so we've got a lot of quantitative data, but also a lot of qualitative data from our studies. And so we've done focus group interviews and face-to-face interviews and observations. And what we found through these responses is that the SOAR professional learning had a greatest impact on teacher metacognition. And this came up over and over again. You can see it in some of our publications. Teachers indicated that the metacognitive activities that they were engaged in using the frames as a lens in these cycles of inquiry were key to building instructional capacity with SOAR. And they cited metacognition numerous times as a driving force behind the changes that they were seeing in their own practice. And coaches and principals also cited metacognition and the use of SOAR as a lens as really one of the driving forces that was elevating teachers' practice. And many of our participants described the professional learning around SOAR as having made them more aware of what they were doing in the classroom and more intentional about how they approached academic language and literacy teaching. So things like building disciplinary conversation skills and encouraging student partnerships for conversation were things that they talked about being much more intentional about. But they also discussed the idea that the cross-cutting practices really help them think metacognitively about their teaching. So teachers have told us that while I was doing discussion with my students and they give them a prompt and they were talking, but I didn't realize till I really started listening to these discussions that they weren't really going very deep with their discussions. And then what I realized when I used the SOAR as a lens was that I wasn't always intentionally building the academic language they needed for discussion, or they might not have been sure what to do when a discussion was stalled. They didn't know what strategies to use, so I needed to foster their metacognition. And I needed to do a better job in the monitoring and guiding to prompt them to dig deeper during discussion. So this look at the frame really helped teachers to think about those cross-cutting practices and how important they are for the implementation of the high impact practice. So that to us was a very key takeaway for some of the things that teachers really talk about in terms of the greatest impact of the SOAR work. Oh, and so we have another question here, which are what benefits for English learners have you found? So I'll start and then let Bob and Debbie add to this. I mean, certainly from a research point of view in our work that we've done in studies, we have looked at English language learners as a subgroup, and we've seen significant shifts in terms of their outcomes on state tests, as well as their shift in English language proficiency. And in fact, in one of the districts that we had worked with, the shift in English language proficiency had been kind of stalled for a while. And then the introduction of the SOAR frames district-wide really started to, they started to see great gains in terms of how their English language learners were doing. We also walked classrooms, and we've walked classrooms with other educators with many early language learners, very young, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And even though we created SOAR and we've done the work, we were sort of overcome by the level of discussion and talk that these young English learners were engaged in. So I think the structure for the teachers and the professional learning has allowed them to really support lots and lots of student-to-student talk. And that then the teachers start to also realize how much their students are capable of when the structure and support is there. So with that, I'll just see if Bob and Debbie want to say any more about the English learner question.
No, Susan, nothing about that. I do have another question that came in about teacher prep programs. And the question specifically was, how do you imagine the book could be used in teacher prep programs? So let me say, first of all three of us have had extensive experience working with beginning teachers, and that experience certainly informed the development of the SOAR teaching frames. But more specifically in regard to how the book could be used, I see two general ways. One certainly is as a text in pedagogy or literacy courses. We have some colleagues that we know that are beginning to experiment in that regard by having it as a text, and this is the first semester it's been available for that. but that certainly is one possible use. The other thing that has come to our attention is people who supervise student teachers using a teaching frame as a lens for their when they do the observation. They are looking for the practices in the frame, and then they use that as the basis for the feedback that they provide.
So I think that is all of the questions that came in. Really appreciate you joining us today. We encourage you to check the book out and certainly to check our resources and website out. And thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.